Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar of our new series, Bringing Data to Life. My name is Beth, and I work at the Office for National Statistics. We're delighted to see so many of you join us today for our webinar on consumer price statistics and how we measure the cost of living. Before we start, we'd like to remind you that all the webinars in this series will be recorded and they will be available on YouTube after the event. Our first two webinars, which explore an introduction to statistics and environmental statistics, are now on the ONS YouTube channel. Everyone signed up to this webinar will receive a link once today's recording is available. With so many of you joining us today, the chat function is closed and all questions will be facilitated through Slido, and I'll cover this in more detail in just a moment. This webinar series is for everyone. Please share the recording and slides when they're available and join the conversation on socials using the hashtag statistics for the public good. Lastly, you will be invited to complete a short survey at the end of the webinar, and we'd really welcome your feedback on the webinar series and the statistics we produce. The session is interactive and there will be questions for you to answer, so please do join in. There are a few ways you can get onto Slido. Firstly, you can scan the QR code that's on the screen at the moment with a mobile device. You can also go to slido.com on any web browser and input the number on the screen. Or lastly, if you're using the desktop version of Teams, you can click the S icon for Slido at the top of your Teams window. The Slido code is 2861192, and this number will appear on every slide, so don't worry if you miss it. I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. We'll first hear from Chris Jenkins, who is Assistant Deputy Director of the Prices Division at the ONS. Chris will be sharing an introduction to statistics and explain how we calculate inflation in consumer prices, as well as giving insight into the future of our consumer price statistics. We're also pleased to be joined by Tara Murphy from His Majesty's Treasury. Tara is head of the Treasury's inflation branch, and she'll be explaining how inflation can impact the economy and be used to set the direction for economic policy. Thank you once again so much for joining, and I'll now hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Bethan, and good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for joining us. So inflation is important. It can be defined as the rate of increase in prices over a given period of time. So I'm going to spend a bit of time this afternoon just talking you through how we produce these inflation measures at the ONS, what measures we produce, and how we collect the data and how we use the data to give us these monthly estimates of inflation each month. Okay, can we go on to the next slide, please? So as I said, inflation can be defined as the rate of increase in prices over a given period of time. It's typically a broad measure, such as the overall increase in prices or the increase in the cost of living within a country. So most of our headline indices at the ONS measure inflation at the aggregate or macroeconomic level. And I've already said inflation is important. Firstly, it tells us how much the prices of goods and services are increasing or decreasing. It is also an important indicator of the economy's health, where governments and central banks use, for example, the consumer price index to make economic or monetary policy decisions. And we'll hear more about how our measures of inflation are used from Tara a bit later in this session. So price indices are also used to make inflationary adjustments, such as wage adjustments, benefit adjustments, or contract escalation. So inflation matters as it affects us all. At the ONS, we measure inflation from a number of different perspectives. So firstly, we measure it from the consumer perspective. So how much of the goods and services we buy as consumers increasing or decreasing. We also try and break this down into how inflation affects different household groups, such as pensioner and non-pensioner households, via our experimental household cost indices. We measure how much prices are increasing across the housing market in the UK via our house price index and our price index of private rents. And then finally, we also capture inflation from the business perspective. So our producer prices measure the change in price of the raw materials that are used in manufacturing. So these are called input price indices, along with the cost of goods leaving the factory, which are known as output prices. So we produce like a vast array of price indices every month. But today we're going to be focusing on the consumer perspective. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to give an overview of what consumer prices are and how we produce them. So we're going to, as I said, today we're going to focus on the consumer inflation. So at the ONS, we don't produce one index. We produce a suite of indices as set out in our consumer prices landscape. We have our headline measures of consumer inflation, which are produced to economic principles. And these are the Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupier housing costs, or CPIH, and the Consumer Prices Index, or the CPI. So CPIH is our most comprehensive and lead measure of inflation, as it includes a measure of housing costs, the H. And this is also known as owner-occupier housing costs, or OOH for short. So these are not house prices, but the housing costs for homeowners, and that is the price of the housing services, such as shelter, that you get from your house. The approach to measuring the price of owner-occupier housing that we favour at the ONS is known as rental equivalence, and this values the housing services you get from your house by looking at what it would cost to rent an equivalent property. And this is based on the idea that if you did not own a house, you would need to rent one. So therefore, we see the rental or the equivalent rent as a good proxy for the costs of housing for owner-occupiers. The CPI is our internationally comparable measure of inflation, and it's produced in line with wider international guidelines, and it's the target measure used by the Bank of England in its monetary policy. CPI and CPIH are aggregate measures for the UK. However, users also want to know how inflation directly impacts them, so we have introduced our experimental household cost indices, or the HCIs. The HCIs aim to measure inflation as experienced by households and allow comparisons between different groups in the population, and they're based on a payments approach as opposed to acquisition. And then finally, we have our legacy measure of inflation, which is the Retail Prices Index. So that's a high-level kind of overview of the indices we produce to measure consumer inflation. So now we're going to look in a bit more detail at some of the methods we use to actually calculate the indices. So for consumer price inflation, our central aim is to measure how much prices for all consumers in the UK are either going up or down. So we are producing an average overall measure, and we do this by collecting prices for a large virtual shopping basket of goods and services each month. As the prices of the various items within the basket change over time, so does the total cost of this basket, and movements in consumer price indices represent this change. So within each calendar year, the basket contents are fixed so that changes in the indices from month to month reflect only changes in prices and not any variation in the quality or quantity of the items that we're purchasing. So we don't want changes that are not inflationary distorting our price indices. However, our virtual basket is updated annually, and it is designed to be representative of the goods and services we typically spend our money on as consumers. So the virtual basket includes around 700 items, where an item can range from frequently purchased staples, such as a loaf of white bread, a pint of milk, through to other things that we purchase, like a meal out, cinema admission, or big ticket items, such as buying a car and even booking a holiday. So updating our virtual basket is very important and usually gets a lot of attention each year. We want to ensure our basket is representative of what we as consumers are purchasing. So we spend a lot of time and effort analysing the basket during the year ahead of the update every March. We use various sources of information to review and update the basket, including our living cost and food survey, market research data, trade journals, and press reports. We are also heavily reliant on intelligence being reported to us from our team of price collectors who visit shops each month and capture what changes in spending habits are taking place that we may need to reflect in the basket changes. So, for example, our price collectors tell us what is selling, what is not selling, what products and items are taking up the most shelf space, etc. There are a series of considerations we take when assessing what goes into our inflation basket or what should be removed each year. So firstly, we need to collect prices for items in the basket. So this is an obvious consideration. If we can't collect a price, then it's counterproductive including the item within the basket. Likewise, we ideally want to include an item where it is available throughout the year, although there will be exceptions with seasonal items such as garden barbecues and winter jackets, which are only available when they're in season. So probably the biggest indicator of what goes in and out of the basket is the amount we spend on the item in terms of expenditure. So remembering we're trying to produce a basket that captures most of what we as consumers spend our money on, we have some broad rules by way of a guide. So where there's an item with expenditure of over £400 million per year, we will consider that for inclusion in the basket. And where there's an item with expenditure of less than £100 million a year, we will consider that for removal. But there's a key point to consider here though. It must be sustained. So we wouldn't want to update the basket to include a short burst of spending that is likely to fall away. And an example here is during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people had to wear face masks, there was a big increase in spending on face masks, but that was unlikely to be sustained, so we didn't include face masks within our virtual basket. So ideally, the expenditure should reflect evolving taste over a run of years and not just one. Finally, we also carry out more statistical analysis. So we monitor the variability of price across the basket. So if we have an area of the basket with high price variability, we will look to introduce a new item to try and help reduce that variance. And likewise, we analyse the balance of items across the basket. So we only have limited resources, so we need to ensure we share out the items for which we can collect prices across the whole range of goods and services within our virtual basket. So thinking about the most recent trends, we're going to try an interactive session here. So we're going to ask, what goods or services do you think were added or removed from our virtual basket in 2024 based on 2023 consumer habits? So using Slido, it'd be helpful if you could log into Slido and then give us your opinion on what was added or removed from the basket this year. Yeah, there's some really ideas coming in. Of course, air fryers, vinyl records. I think we might have given that away with the webinar title. Hand sanitizer, avocados. Yeah, there's lots of real good ideas coming in there. So thanks for taking part. So in terms of what we did kind of add and remove from the basket, looking at what we added, so gluten-free bread was added to the basket to reflect the increase in shelf space and range of gluten-free products now available to consume. Everyone, I think, correctly said air fryers, and they were another addition, with consumers reportedly drawn to the energy-saving features as well as the health benefits compared with conventional fryers. And spending on cooking items such as air fryers reportedly increased by over 30% between 2021 and 2022. So we've seen this big increase in popularity for air fryers. Rice cakes were introduced to expand the representation of cereals, with our research suggesting a growing popularity as part of a healthier lifestyle. And then with the analysis of a broad balance of representative items within our basket, it highlighted a need to remove or to improve coverage, across a range of categories, including recorded media, games, toys, and hobbies. So in this case, vinyl records were added back into the basket for the first time in over 30 years, reflecting resurgence in the popularity of vinyl records. Then moving on to removals, someone quite correctly said hand hygiene gel was removed, and we had seen a reduction in shelf space since the height of the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. So we removed hand gel as a result. We also removed draft stout, which was overrepresented in the basket. So analysis had shown that price movements are similar for draft stout compared to draft bitter. So by dropping this item, it would have little impact, as we are confident that the price movements for this item were represented by the bitter item. We identified that collection issues cannot influence changes, and as such, a hot rotisserie chicken has been dropped from the basket because evidence suggests that it's now been removed from supermarkets and they've stopped selling them, so we couldn't actually collect the item. And then takeaway tea and coffee, they were previously two separate items, but they've been merged into one takeaway hot drink item. Again, this aims to rebalance the basket and reduce coverage in some areas, so it frees up resources to improve our collection in other areas of the basket. So we've spoken about how we update the virtual basket. We're now going to look at the way it is used to compile our price indices. So once we have our virtual basket, we then fix it for a period of 12 months. So using the fixed basket approach helps us understand and reflect the importance of the items we consume. So we try to reflect the relative importance of what people consume within our virtual basket by the use of weights. So for example, if we spend more on one item than another, such as spending more on petrol than apples, then we would expect a change in the price of petrol to have a bigger impact on overall inflation than that for apples. And we do this by weighting the items in the basket according to the expenditure. So a weight is simply the amount we spend on one item in the basket relative to the overall basket spend. So for example, if we spend £10 on petrol against an overall spend of £100 on the whole basket, then petrol will have a weight of 10% within our price index. And importantly, weights also allow us to combine or aggregate each item to give us our overall measure of consumer inflation. So the weights are important, and they're updated annually alongside the basket to ensure they remain reflective of changing consumer spending habits. The other important point to note when we say fixed basket is that we fix it in terms of the quality and quantity of goods and services it contains. And this brings us to one of the most important principles of our price index, and that's price into constant quality. So we collect prices for the exact same quality and quantity of a good or service each period to ensure we only reflect genuine inflationary pressures within our price index. So any change in quality is highlighted by our price collectors and adjusted out of our calculations. So to explain this in a bit more detail, we need to price the constant quality so that we are only measuring pure price change and not a price change driven by a change in size or attributes. So in an ideal world, we could price like for like each month, but we know products change and we need to replace them. So if we do replace, then we need to ensure that we are accounting for any change in quality, and we are heavily reliant on our price collectors to monitor and capture these changes for us each month. Some changes we can accept as comparable, as there is no change in a price associated with that change in good. So for example, the smell of an air freshener might change between collections, and we would deem this as comparable. However, in other instances, particularly if it's a change in one of the main price determining characteristics for an item, we would capture that as a quality change, and then we would need to take action. So perhaps the best known method of quality adjustment is when the size of a good reduces, but the price remains the same. In this instance, our price collectors would flag the change, and there is a clear change in quality for the consumer as you were getting less good for your money. And then we would make an adjustment, in this case, to show the reduction in size as a price increase in our index. So we're stripping out that change in quality. So we're going to use Slido again to ask you what you think is a quality change for certain changes that we would have experienced in our price collection. So within Slido, there should be a poll. And which of these do you think is a quality change? So if a jar of coffee increases from 500 to 1 kilogram, a t-shirt changes color from red to green, a computer's processing speed increases or decreases, and an optional extra is removed from a car insurance policy. Okay, the results are starting to come through. So it seems most people agree that a computer's processing speed that increases or decreases the quality change, and that would be right, because if you're buying a computer with a higher processing speed, that's going to be a price change because you've changed the quality of the computer. So we would have to treat that as a quality change. Likewise, a jar of coffee increasing from 500 grams to 1 kilogram is a change in quality because you would see a change in price that's connected to the change in size. So we wouldn't want to reflect that in the index. We would want to strip out that change in quality. An optional extra is removed from a car insurance policy. Again, that's a quality change because you're now reducing the quality of the car insurance policy that's going to lead to a change in price. And then most people, or only a few people have said a t-shirt changes color from red to green. We would treat that as a comparable change, so not a quality change, because there's no real change in price associated with picking a red or a green t-shirt. So these are some of the things that we need to think about when we're producing the index and collecting the prices each month. So we've introduced the virtual basket and the concept of fixing the basket and why we do it. Now we'll turn to the prices we use and how we collect them. So for consumer inflation, we are trying to reflect the amount we pay as a consumer for the goods and services within our basket. We can't collect every price. We therefore take a representative sample that allows us to estimate the general price movements. We currently use around 180,000 price observations each month across the basket, which are collected across around 140 locations in the UK. This ensures that we are capturing as far as possible any regional differences within our overall index. To collect the prices, we use several different collection modes. Next slide, please. So we get administrative data from many items in the basket, such as data from other government departments. And that means in these cases that we don't have to collect the data for ourselves. So for example, we get rental price data from the Valuation Office Agency and the devolved administrations. There are 4 other main modes of collection that are used to produce our consumer inflation. So firstly, our local collections, which are carried out on our behalf by a third party, Varian. We call it local collection as via Varian, we send price collectors into the stores and shops around the country to collect the prices for items within our basket. These price quotes are collected monthly from local shops across all regions, and roughly 80% of all raw price data is collected this way. As I've already said, we're indebted to the expertise of our price collectors. It's not just collecting a price each month, but they need to monitor what products are selling or not selling, carefully capture any changes in product or quality so that we can just it out, understand and record reasons for price change so we can build a clear picture of what's happening to the various items in our basket, and generally ensure that we are getting as many correct price quotes as possible each period. So it's a huge thanks to all involved. Similarly, we carry out what we call central collection within the ONS. We don't need to physically visit shops for this collection, but our price collectors play an equally important role. So firstly, we have central shop collections, and these are to supplement the local collection through online price collection. So for example, using supermarket websites, central shops are effectively where there is a national pricing policy, and we can either collect the price via the internet or via email each month. We then have the general central collection, and this is done either via the internet or via telephone. So for the first component of the general collection, we will aim to capture prices that are available online, but where there is variation across the country, such as gas and electric bills, package holidays, or travel items such as airfares. We then use phone collections to cover those areas of the basket where there isn't an online price available, such as local plumbers, electricians, etc. Again, we'll be looking to capture any regional variations in these collections. So it sounds obvious to say, but price collection and getting it correct is essential for our consumer price indices. It's also worth noting that the same price collection is used across our suite of consumer inflation. So the same price data feed into CPIH, CPI, HCIs, and the RPI. So once we have our virtual basket, we have our weights and we have our prices, we can combine them together to produce our measures of consumer inflation. The chart on the left shows the CPI, the CPIH, and owner-occupier housing costs over the last 12 years in terms of the annual inflation rate, which we published yesterday. So the annual inflation rate reflects the percentage change for the cost of the current month's basket compared to the same month last year. So an inflation rate of 3.2% means, on average, the basket is 3.2% more expensive than last year. As you can see from the left-hand chart, inflation has slowed considerably over the last year or so from a recent high of around 10%. However, a key point here is that slowing inflation doesn't necessarily mean prices are falling. It just means that they're going up by less than they were last year. Unfortunately, prices are still going up. It's also worth reiterating that our headline measures of inflation are designed to be representative of spending habits across the UK as a whole, and may not totally reflect the habits of any individual consumer. We have developed the personal inflation calculator on the ONS website to allow our users to calculate their own inflation rate based on what they spend their money on. And this is available on the ONS website, and we'll circulate a link following the webinar. So we've spoke about how we currently produce the consumer price index and the consumer price index, including owner-occupier housing costs. This is the standard approach in terms of how we produce consumer inflation. I just want to quickly touch on some of our plans to transform the way we do this before I hand over to Tara. So over the last few years, we've been working to transform our consumer price statistics by making use of new alternative big data sources. So most notably is the plan to use scanner data. So scanner data comes from large retailers where the price of every item that is scanned at the till is recorded and sent to us for use in consumer inflation. The benefit of scanner data is that we will also know how much of a good we are consuming so that we can pick up any change in spending patterns quickly and reflect this in our indices, unlike with the fixed basket approach. Although I should point out at this stage that we only capture price and volume data, and no information on any individual is received via the scanner data we get. So in terms of magnitude, scanner data will take us from almost 180,000 price points per month to over 300 million. This is a huge increase that will initially be for groceries only, and it will allow us to tell us a much more granular story around what is driving price changes in this area of our basket. However, such a scaling up comes with its challenges. So we've been working to research, develop and test new methodologies to process such big data, as our traditional fixed basket approach won't work with these big data sets. We have been developing statistical systems and pipelines to cope with hundreds of millions of data points, and finally embedding new processes to give us the means to handle such big data. So it's not an easy task. Our primary objective here for the transformation project is improving the accuracy and representativity of our inflation statistics. And finally, these new data will help us inform the narrative of why inflation is the way it is for our users, whilst also giving our policymakers the confidence, tools, and higher quality statistics they need to make better decisions. So for example, earlier this year, we published our new rental price index. By getting access to the rental microdata, which we previously didn't have, we are now able to produce our rental estimates at a much more granular level. So originally we used to produce at the regional level only, but now we publish rental estimates at the local authority level, enabling us to tell a much more granular story of the property market each month. So I'm now going to hand over to Tara, who's going to take us through how our inflation measures are used. Over to you, Tara.
Thanks very much, Chris. So hello, thanks for joining everyone. My name is Tara and I'm an economist at His Majesty's Treasury. Today I'd like to take you through why ONS price data is vital for the Treasury and how we use inflation to support our goals as a department. But before we start, I'd like to hear from you. Why do you think inflation is important? And you can answer using the Slido poll, as we've been doing. Yeah, it's really important for policy. Wow, loads of answers here. Yeah, interest rates, cost of living, devalues our savings, affects the economy. Fantastic. I can tell you're all economists. Okay, so as you've identified, inflation isn't just a number. It tells the story of how prices change and the experience of every single person in the UK. And this is what our work at the Treasury is all about. As the Economics and Finance Ministry, the Treasury's goal is to maintain control over public spending, to set the direction of UK's economic policy, and to achieve strong and sustainable economic growth. But before I get into that, I think it's worth briefly mentioning the role of the Bank of England. It's the bank's job to keep inflation low and stable, and whilst the government asks the bank to keep inflation at 2%, they operate independently of the Treasury. So even though controlling inflation isn't directly the Treasury's job, it significantly impacts our goals. So how does that work? Well, I'm sure you all remember the recent cost of living crisis. And high inflation meant that your money didn't stretch as far each month, and it became hard to budget because price changes were unpredictable. Take mortgages, for example. To fight inflation, the Bank of England increased interest rates, and suddenly homeowners faced higher monthly payments. It goes deeper than just our experience as individuals. Inflation affects other areas of the economy too, like business investment. Unpredictable price rises make business planning incredibly challenging. Would you invest millions in a new factory if you couldn't predict your project costs or selling prices? Lack of spending and business activity hurts economic growth. If businesses are struggling, they may make redundancies. And these factors are all crucial for the prosperity of our country. So understanding inflation is key for the Treasury. Inflation is also important for the government's budget. Like for households, unpredictable inflation makes it hard for the government to plan. High inflation can mean that departmental budgets don't stretch as far, which may mean that they need more money to provide the same level of service, or they must make savings. And this puts pressure on public spending, which the Treasury controls. Inflation also directly influences some government policies. For example, it set in legislation that there's a triple lock on the state pension, which ensures that pensions increase each year at least as much as inflation. And some tax rates, such as alcohol duty, also typically increase each year in line with inflation. And VAT is applied to the price of goods, meaning higher prices leads to a higher tax take. So the rate of inflation therefore impacts how much the government spends and raises each year. Next slide. So we use ONS data to understand the economic picture, how all prices are changing and why. The chart on the left shows that in 2021, 2 pints of semi-skim milk cost 84p. By 2023, this peaked at £1.32 before settling again at £1.24. As Chris talked through, the ONS collect prices like these for over 700 goods each month. So rather than looking at the price chart for each one, because I'd be here all day, we look at the consumer price index, which shows the average price level across the whole economy. And the chart in the middle shows the CPI. And it shows that most items experienced a similar pattern of price rises to milk in the last few years. And that rapid increase in prices across the economy was mainly driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and supply chain disruptions after COVID. The final chart on the right shows the inflation rate for the consumer prices index, and that tells us how quickly prices were increasing. At the Treasury, we use ONS data to analyse what is driving that change. So in 2023, price changes were being driven by energy and other goods, which you can see in the black and grey bars there. Since then, energy inflation has fallen negative, but services inflation still remains high and is pushing up on the overall CPI inflation rate. Next slide, please. In the beginning, I explained that we care about inflation because it affects the health of our economy and the government's budget, but there's a third angle to consider. Whilst the Bank of England controls inflation by setting interest rates, and the government is steadfast in their support of the bank's role, the actions of the Treasury do influence inflation, and we need to understand the inflation backdrop in order to set appropriate economic policy. Building a bridge doesn't just create infrastructure, it can also drive inflation. And government spending on the bridge pays for the raw materials, but it also pays for engineers' wages. With those additional wages, workers might spend more money in local businesses, for example, buying their coffee on the way to work. And in the face of this higher demand, local businesses might increase prices. And even tax policies can have indirect inflation impacts. For example, the sugar tax was originally designed to improve public health via encouraging lower sugar consumption, but it also had the indirect impact of increasing prices of sugary drinks, which would have led to an increase in that item, inflation. The Office for Budget Responsibility are the government's official forecaster, and they calculate the inflationary impact of policies using ONS data. But that data is also influential in the Treasury when we're developing the policies, so that ministers can assess the impact of a policy holistically, not just looking at the potential tax receipts or the public health benefits, but on the economy as a whole. And this is particularly important in periods of high inflation, such as in the past few years. Next slide, please. So I've talked about why inflation is important to us, and in the next slide I'll talk through a case study relating to the energy crisis. But before I get to that, I'm interested in hearing your reflections on how you think energy price inflation impacts people and businesses. I can see a lot of people typing. Here we are. Oh wow, it's all come through on my screen at once. Higher costs, yeah, definitely. Maybe more use of public transport, that's a really interesting one. Eats into revenue and profit, could lead to job losses like we talked about earlier, makes running a business more expensive. Absolutely, raw costs go up. All good points. We'll turn to the case study now, and this kind of demonstrates how we've used ONS price data to influence economic policy in the past. So in 2022, we knew that energy prices were one of the driving factors for the spike in inflation, and we saw that in that chart earlier. Knowing the source of inflation steered the Treasury to provide some support for consumers and businesses for the higher energy costs. The government at the time introduced a policy called the Energy Price Guarantee, which reduced people's energy bills. As well as supporting people with the cost of living, we knew that this policy would also reduce CPI inflation. The pie chart on the right shows us that the energy bills in that orange slice make up about 5% of CPI. And knowing the weight of energy in CPI and the prices, and this allowed us to calculate how changing the price of energy bills would affect the headline measure of inflation. And informed by this analysis, the Office for Budget Responsibility estimated that because of the energy price guarantee, CPI inflation was over 3 percentage points lower than it otherwise would have been at the peak of the crisis. We also used ONS analysis to monitor how energy prices were affecting the rest of the inflation basket. See, a spike in energy inflation affects consumer prices in two ways. First, through the bill to heat your home, and that's represented by that 5% in the pie chart. And second, by increasing the cost for producers to turn the factory or the shop lights on, which is eventually passed on to consumers. And that second channel will affect businesses and their prices differently, depending on how much energy they use in production. For example, restaurants use a lot of energy due to the gas needed to cook the food, whereas clothing isn't very energy intensive because it relies more on workers to make the garments. Categorising businesses in this way helped us understand how the energy crisis was affecting the rest of the economy. Most of the inflation spike in 2023 was driven by businesses that use a lot of energy, shown in the pink and red bars on the chart on the right. And even though energy prices are now falling, the impact of the crisis may still be rippling through the economy, through the secondary impact on services business, for example, where we're still seeing a lot of inflation. This analysis, in turn, informed the government's view on what support for consumers and businesses was most appropriate going forward. Hopefully, this case study has shown that our work with ONS price data is about more than just statistics. It's about understanding economic pressures and protecting household budgets and steering the UK towards economic stability. Thank you for listening, and that's all I'll be covering today, but I'm happy to answer any questions you've got at the end.
Thanks so much, Tara and Chris. Really interesting presentations, and thanks so much to everyone for taking part in our Slido interactions today. We've got about 10 minutes to answer some questions for the rest of our event, and we've had loads of brilliant questions coming through, so thank you so much for submitting those. We will be answering the most popular questions first, so please do give a thumbs up to any questions that you would really like to hear answered. And if we don't have time to get to your question today, the ONS Engagement Hub inbox is always open, and you can get in touch with us through engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk. So let's take a look at some of the questions we've had through. Okay, so Chris, this might be one for you. The top voted is many stores have split pricing, one without a store loyalty card and one with, the latter being cheaper. Which do you use for the basket?
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, this is a really topical question and one we get asked quite a lot. So at the moment, we would use the price without a loyalty card. So one of the principles that we use for our price collection is that the price we're collecting is going to be available to everyone and not discriminatory. So we would kind of say that a price that you need to use a store loyalty card for is discriminatory because you've got to join that loyalty scheme. So we wouldn't collect that price. So at the moment, we're only collecting the price without the loyalty card. But as I've already said, we're looking to introduce big data via scanner data for CPI. And once we get the scanner data live and we're using that to measure the groceries basket, that will effectively then allow us to capture these prices that include the discounts from loyalty cards and the like. So just to confirm, at the moment we use the price that's not available via a loyalty card. We use the shelf price.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And Paul has asked, are there one or two items that have always been in the basket, or has everything been removed at one point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not 100% sure, but I would think that there are items that have been in the baskets for the whole kind of period of our collections. You know, we don't typically make a huge amount of changes because the kind of people's habits that don't change that quickly. So you can imagine perhaps like a pint of milk or some of the staples in terms of the food items that we buy have been in the basket since we've started producing inflation, and that's going back an awful long time.
Thanks, Chris. An anonymous question that we've got at the top. So how is the basket comparable across years if the basket is changing each year?
Okay, yeah, so I've said we use this fixed basket concept. And effectively what we're doing, we're updating the basket every year and we're pricing that new basket from January each year. So the majority of the basket is comparable with the previous year, but there will be changes to reflect, as I've already said, the things that we want to remove and the things that we want to add in. So because we're only pricing that basket from January each year, what we do is we collect prices for both the old basket and the new basket in an overlap month, and then we use that overlap month to chain those movements together. So a process called chain linking allows us to combine the new basket with the old basket to give us this comparable price index that we can use over time. But effectively what we're doing is we're only ever pricing the new basket from January every year.
Thank you, Chris. With 33 votes, we have, how do you calculate the price of an item that is sold at different prices by different sellers? And I suppose this ties into the kind of club card type question. Yeah,
so what we do here is we would try to capture the different prices across a different range of sellers. So, you know, we might select a certain item and price that in a large supermarket, but we'll also kind of price it at, say, an independent retailer or a small corner shop, and then we would take the average of those prices that kind of feed into our index each month. The idea being that we're trying to capture the kind of the average price that we're paying for this good or service. What we wouldn't do though is we wouldn't directly compare, say, the price of a certain item collected at a major retailer one month with the price of an item collected in a small local shop the following month. So we follow the same item within the same seller month on month, and then we take the average. And the reason behind that is because if we're comparing the price perhaps at a major retailer one month with the price at a local corner shop another month, you might get a price change because of your change in where you're collecting that price from rather than pure inflation. So what we do is we follow the same good or service within the same retailer over the full period of the basket, and then we average those prices to give us a representative measure.
Thank you, Chris. I'm conscious lots of these are related to ONS, so I might ask Tara a question that has just come through. So someone has asked, how do you measure when businesses increase their prices due to inflation, but when they don't reduce them when their costs go down?
Thank you for that question. We do this in a couple of ways, actually, still often using ONS data. So, for example, there's survey data we can look at. There's the Business Insights and Conditions Survey, I believe it's called, that asks businesses each month the reason for price rises. And one of those reasons might be raw materials are going up or financing requirements are going up, and that gives us an indication of the driver of inflation. It's a bit more difficult to measure on the way down because the question I think asks about price rises, but yeah, hopefully that answers it.
Thank you, Tara. So the next one is, do you publish baskets or graphs for the poorest 20% and richest 20% as well as the average, or are they more like categories such as single renter without car, retired homeowner, etc.?
So I would have to double check, but I think that's what we publish within our household cost indices. As I've said during the presentation, we're producing this new experimental measure of consumer inflation that allows us to break it down in terms of different groupings of households, and I'm pretty sure we do it by percentiles in terms of income percentile. So I'll double check, and we can circulate the HI release following the webinar.
Great, thank you, Chris. And very last question, I think, before we wrap up. So how does our methodology compare with other countries? And perhaps this is one that both of you might be able to come in on.
Yeah, so I can certainly answer this question. So when we talk about the consumer price index, that was developed back in the late 1990s in line with other European countries. So with the introduction of the EU and the Eurozone, there was a push to get this comparable measure of inflation across European countries called the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, the HICP. So the Consumer Price Index in the UK was developed to be that comparable measure. So effectively the CPI is compiled using the same methodology as other European countries, so it's fully comparable. Then we've got CPIH. So CPIH is using the same methodology as CPI, the only difference being the housing costs element, which is kind of bolted onto CPI, which other European countries don't necessarily use. So in terms of CPI, we're fully comparable. CPIH, we're less comparable because of the housing component that not all countries use.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Unfortunately, we've probably run out of time for questions now, but if you do have any that we haven't answered today that you would like us to get back to you on, just send us an email at engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk and we'll make sure that either someone from ONS or Treasury gets back to you. So that's all we have time for in today's session. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to share that there's always more to learn on this topic, whether that's on social media or online, and you'll find some case studies, explainer articles and lesson plans that you can use to teach others about inflation, and we'll share links to these straight after this call. Our next event in the Bringing Data to Life series is Exploring Health by Numbers, which takes place at 4 p.m. on Thursday, the 12th of December. We'll be joined by the UK Health Security Agency to learn more about measuring the health of the nation and how statistics can be used to detect and respond to outbreaks and inform public health interventions. So it should be an interesting one. We'll send you a link to register after the call, and we hope that you'll be able to join us there. Before you go, we would be really grateful if you could share how you found today's event. This can all be done on the Slido page that you've been using so far, where our quick survey will be live. We'll also send you a link to this once we finish. But thank you again, Chris and Tara, so much for your presentations. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.